just so that if y'all want to go back, y'all can listen to it again or do whatever. All right, so we're talking about lean manufacturing, and we're going to start off with lean history today. So first of all, what is lean? What do y'all think it means to be lean? We use that term a lot, right? Everything from the well-known phrase lean, mean, fighting machine to things like lean meat. So what does it mean? What? There's a lot to it. The very simplest way of talking about lean is generally when we're talking about, it's generally when they used to talk about butchering animals where they were talking about trimming all the fat away. That's what it means to be lean meat. It means there's almost no fat to it. This is very similar. It's how do we look at processes and how do we trim away what we don't need? Does that make sense? So we're going to talk a little bit about where it came from and who came up with it, how and where it applies, and why does it matter. Okay? So where it began, there are a lot of different places where it could say you can start it. Where most people say it started is places like Eli Whitney, where he created interchangeable parts. Why is that important? Well, before that, everything was custom work. What is the problem with custom work? If something breaks, you got to wait for the person that made it to fix it. Okay? So what is that? Why is that problems? Well, if you have to go to a blacksmith to get, 1,000 nails to put your house together, and all of a sudden you lose half your nails, you gotta go back to the blacksmith. You can't just go to the store and buy them all the same. So interchangeable parts are a big thing. If I remember right, one of the biggest things he did with interchangeables was he improved on a rifle. He actually created a bunch of rifles for the American Revolution. And his parts were all interchangeable, so if one soldier's weapon broke and you had a spare, you could fix it. Much easier. You didn't have to sit there and go, hey, my piece is broken. I can't do anything with this. Sorry, I gotta go home. Nah. Here's a spare. It doesn't work, but we can strip it for parts. Kind of like your car, right? That's the best thing about cars these days is you can use any car of that model to fix it. Headlights are interchangeable, the engine's interchangeable, everything can be replaced easily. Versus the really, really old cars when they first came out. What did you have to do? You had to always go to the dealer. What did they have to sometimes do? Order extremely specialized parts they did not have on hand. Yeah, we'll talk about that later. So then you have a guy named Frederick Taylor who started looking at individual processes and started studying the time frames it took for these processes. So what does that mean? Well, that means that if you're doing a full assembly, how long does this process take? How long does this process take? How long does this process take? How long does the process take in total? Is there ways we can cut down on time? Because what is the biggest saying about time? Time is what? Time is money. Motion studies and process charting were added by a pair called Frank and Lillian Garbeth. So again, that's always just studying the process. How can I make this easier? How can I make this less of a mess? Because any of you have ever witnessed manufacturing, how messy is it? It's quite messy, and it generally is very clunky, isn't it? If you start really looking at it long enough, you can start seeing ways of, oh, well, this person can do this. This machine can do better at this if we just do this, that, and another. Right? And these days, it's all about cutting down time. Why? Because that's also trying to cut down cost, which cost cutting down then translates to consumer spending less. Right? All right. So we also talk about Henry Ford with this because he's not so much the creator of the assembly line so much as the guy that really got it into use. Him and Charles Sorson really worked out the strategy of it, and they were the ones that first started the assembly line and said, okay, so this is how we're going to do it. This is the way we will do it. Now, what's the problem with Ford's assembly line? His was very clunky, more than anything. The biggest issue with Ford's and the biggest issue people later had with his cars was that he only had something like one color. He could only make his car in the color black. He could not make his manufacturing process change. Any type of change in the process threw them off badly. Ford was known to say, well, you don't need the car in any color, just make it black. We're not going to change it from this color. He's a very interesting character. But he got stubborn about it because he would tell people, no, I'm not changing my system. General Motors eventually knocked him off his pedestal, and so he created the cheapest car, but his inability to have any change really kicked him in the shin later. Okay? Because what do people like? We like choices. So then we have this Toyota. So Toyota, when it first came out, weren't the best cars. None of the cars that we have today were the best cars when they first came out. But after World War II, when Japan was rebuilding, you had gentlemen like Taichi Ono and Shigo Shingo, which, yes, those names are not easy to say. Japanese industrialists like these guys were looking at the Ford system. They did it with a different lens. The thing about the Japanese is what? It's a very small chain of islands, right? Very limited resources. So they're looking at it at a lens of how can I make the process better, easier, and save everything I can. So they took that concept of the assembly line and they started saying, okay, how can we apply this to our thing? How can we apply this to Toyota? So they looked at the quality control process of other American companies. They looked at all of that and they said, okay, let's narrow this down. We're going to go to the companies that supply us. We're going to go to the people that supply our seats. We're going to go to the people that supply our electronics. We're going to go to these, that, and another. And we're going to create a system called just-in-time. Okay? Just-in-time means that I order from you, I get it that second. I stay at the very edge of this is what I have, this is what I need from you. Okay? Does that make sense, guys? And of course, the Americans were also dealing with labor unions at that time, so that's about the time Toyota started taking off and Ford started his major fall. So we have what's called the Toyota production system that was began and implemented between 1949 and 1975. And the whole thing is they did not want somebody inspecting the vehicles at the very end. Because by that time, what happens? I've got 50 other cars backed up here that might have a flaw that this one right here has. What's that end up costing me? Ends up costing me time, ends up costing me money, ends up costing me major. So what they created was, all my employees, you have the ability to stop the line at any time. They gave the power to their employees that if they saw something wrong, if they saw something that red flagged for them, they had to reach up, grab a cord, pull it, stop the line. They fix it right then. Nobody had ever done that. Why? Because most companies feel it slows it down. However, what was Toyota known for the most part for? They became known for their quality product. And it's because they look for that defect. So you have a source inspection. You have each employee inspecting the product before it gets away from them. I've done my job. Oh, here's this bad weld. Hey, we need to send this back and get it re-welded. Instead of, hey, this is about to drive off the lot. That's a bad weld. A lot of companies have entire parking lots full of what? Huh? Of cars that have defects. Most of the defects are not terrible. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Just small defects. It ends up costing companies thousands and thousands of dollars. How much does a Mercedes cost? About $40,000 at the cheapest end, a couple $100,000 at the most expensive end, yes? How many cars sit on that lot? Several hundred cars? How much money are you tying up in just inventory? How much money do you end up tying up in inventory? How much money do you end up tying up, period? So, I mean, y'all are getting it right now. That's the biggest issue. The more inventory you have, the more money you tie up. All right? If I've got, let's say, 600,000 cars, all worth $100,000, how much money is sitting on that lot? All my money gets tied up in inventory. Can I afford to pay my vendors? Can I afford to pay my employees? This is something the Japanese realized. That's why they started this thing of stop it before it gets over it. Because if I stop it here before it leaves that place, let's say if I'm in the welding shop, if I stop the line before it leaves because I notice a bad weld or something didn't get ground down right, what does that leave me with? A, it leaves me with a better product. B, I don't have 600,000 cars waiting to be fixed. Yeah, if it snakes by me, I don't have a lawsuit. I think of all the recalls Toyota's had, I think there was only ever one major problem, and that was with floor mats that kept catching the gas pedal. I think that was whenever y'all were all, I don't know, how old are y'all? Mostly in your 20s? That would have been in your young teens. Because that happened when I entered college. So that would have been over a decade ago. So yeah, y'all would have been young. So if you stop it before it gets off the line, you do not end up with inventory. You don't have to wait for somebody to fix it. It just goes to the dealer and they sell it. It's a practice of making only what you need, trimming away the excess. So lean is the biggest, newest venture that most businesses are going into. Why? Because unless you're a retail business, do you need to keep stock on anything? Well, not unless you hit a pandemic. All right, so quick little quiz. Who should be considered the fathers of modern lean manufacturing?
Well, I guess the CEO and
It would be B. No, Ford didn't care. Okay, if you ever really look at Henry Ford, the guy's how to say this nicely, because my mama raised me better. Ford was a little psychotic. If you ever start really reading into Ford, he didn't care about his employees. He cared about the almighty dollar. No. Ford was, I won't say he was a bad guy, but he wasn't a good guy. Ford, I'll put it to you this way, and this is one of those things that if you ever really do the research into him, it just gets a little bit out there. Ford decided he didn't want to pay prices for rubber, so he went down to South America, cleared a bunch of land, and created his own little American Ford land in the middle of this place so he could harvest rubber for tires because he wanted to be a rubber baron along with selling his product. He didn't really care about his workers. If you read about it, it just is one of those things of, wow, he was not a good guy. We tend to celebrate him for what he did, and there's a reason we don't really talk about him as a person most of the time, because he was not a good guy. He was kind of a Scrooge McDuck. How about that? Y'all know what I'm talking about, Scrooge McDuck, right? The only thing he cares about is the what? The almighty dollar. That was Henry Ford. Okay. Who's credited for making the revolutionary changes to the assembly line to make it better? He's not the one that created it, but he made changes to make it better. Nope. They improved it to the max, but the one that initially made it better, that is Ford. Oh.
I think the way the difference was Ford's was movable and the other guys wasn't stationary.
I can't remember, and honestly, if you really want to talk assembly lines, you have to talk back all the way to the beginning of factories. Because let's just talk textiles. Do y'all know how textiles work? You've got to, if it's cotton, you've got to pick the cotton, process the cotton, and everything just keeps moving down the line. You got to spin it into yarn, blah, 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 and then you go down all the way to the weavers. Most of the time, that was in a factory of its own. So you would have, let's say, wool. A bunch of sheep get sheared down for their wool, right? So they bring it into the factory as its raw state. It's got to be washed and combed out to make sure there's no dirt or gross whatever in it. And then it goes to the people that spin it into thread. And then once it got spun into thread, they would hand it off to the people that would, spin it into a thicker thread, and then so on and so forth until they're ready to weave it into cloth. Technically, that is assembly line work. If you really stop to think about it. Because what is going on? You're moving a raw product from beginning to end. What Ford did was basically the same thing on a bigger scale that moved on its own. Because you didn't have somebody sitting there going, okay, here's my thread I just spun. I'm handing it over to the weavers. Instead, you had everybody toss it into a giant bin and they moved to the weavers that way. Again, it's same process, different name. Okay? So Ford made the improvement on it in the fact that he mechanized it and he knew how to set up around that line. Does that make sense? So what was the biggest failing of Ford's production system? There's actually a couple of right answers to this. A and B were probably his biggest ones because he did not like to change. Customers come to him saying, can we kind of produce this in, let's say, red? Nah, you're good with black. The system itself was completely inflexible, though. Anytime change was needed, basically you had to break the whole system down just to change one thing. And Ford didn't feel like spending the money doing that. If you really want the honest truth on that one. In the West, Toyota systems are implemented as, and it is a lean manufacturing. What we have done before that is traditional manufacturing, and that is going the way of the dinosaur quick. Why? Because companies that still implement that, where they manufacture large batches of stuff that people don't even need, that tends to go away now. Why? Because people are finally realizing, let me put it to you this way. Y'all ever shop at Steinmart or at TJ Maxx? That is what happens to large batch manufacturing. Okay? Large batch manufacturing. I am a textile person and I say, I want a round number, 500,000, multiple sizes of this shirt. But I might not sell it. What if I cannot sell that much? Instead of saying, okay, let's test out the market, let's make 500, not 5,000. I can then take 100 and distribute it to different stores. See how it sells, right? With the major batch production, I might get stuck with 1,000 shirts. And where do I have to then turn around and sell them off to? Places like TJ Maxx. So we're going to sell them for pennies on the dollar. Okay? This is very typical of large batch manufacturing. Small batch manufacturing or lean manufacturing, what you do is you wait for the order to come to you. You don't just sit there and randomly go, okay, well, I've got all this fabric, so 500,000 shirts. Nobody bought that. I'm out a lot of money. So lean manufacturing is pretty much becoming the big thing these days. All right. So pause that.